In this game, Bobby Fischer creates a beautiful mating pattern, all the more impressive because it's not a study, but it happened in an actual game. His opponent grabs a lot of space and Fischer counterattacks. He's playing against someone who would later become an international master, René Letelier from Chile, who lived to 91 years of age, passed away in 2006. A very beautiful game. I hope you enjoy it. Fischer had the black pieces. Letelier had white. He began with d4. Fischer played his King's Indian defense, which he played almost exclusively at this stage of his career. This was in 1960. Bishop g7, e4. And the idea for black, who almost always plays d6 here, to keep white from playing e5. If white plays e5, then you take exchange queens, and quickly black gets a lot of pressure on the queen side and is just better. But Fischer here plays e4, a real provocation, letting white know they can play e5 if they want, if they're prepared to deal with the consequences. And white does play e5. Fischer retreats the knight back to e8, and then f4. Now, to just eyeball this position, you would think white was just clearly better, with this massive pawn center and black's pieces all on the back rank, with the exception of the bishop at g7. But all is not so simple. The main problem for white is this king on e1. Where is it going to find safety now? If he can maintain that center, he'll be fine, but if he can't, he's going to be in big trouble. Fischer begins to nibble at the center by playing d6, bishop to e3. He doesn't want to play the knight to f3 and allow this pin just yet. Just like in an Alekhine defense, you see the same idea. Then c5. So Fischer is putting as much pressure on the dark squares as he can possibly play. ED6 would be an inaccuracy because black could play CD4, and after bishop b4, just play knight f6, and if he takes on e7, queen e7, and again, white's king is in big trouble. He's nowhere near castling, and castling on the queen side would be too dangerous. But instead, he plays dc5. Fischer responds with knight to c6. He can't take on c5 because his own queen is pinned at the moment. The pawn on d6 is pinned. cd6. So Letelier keeps grabbing material. He takes the pawn at d6 now. William Lombardi, and also a strong grandmaster and close friend of Bobby Fischer, said that this material that he's getting, that they were ill-gotten gains. He's grabbing the material now, but he'll pay the price later. Bobby Fischer recaptures the pawn, and here his last chance for equality for white was knight f3, with the idea of bishop e2 and short castling, but instead he plays the more aggressive knight to e4, clearly aiming at this d6 square and pawn, and Fischer goes ahead and plays bishop to f5. He says, you can take the pawn at d6. He doesn't, but he probably should have, actually. The best move here is knight to d6. But after a few moves, knight d6, the queens get exchanged, and black's activity is still probably too much, although white's not lost yet. But black has a very active position. But instead, he plays knight to g3. And you can see what white is hoping for is to control this f5 square and advance his own pawn to f5 and get counterplay. So he attacks the bishop at f5. Fischer just moves it to e6. The knight comes to f3. And then he plays queen to c7. Modern computers show us that de5 is probably a little stronger than queen to c7 after the exchange of queens. You can just see black's activity is too much. But I'm very glad that Fischer did not play that move. It would have robbed us of a very impressive conclusion. So he plays queen to c7 instead. And now queen to b1. And we see white continuing this idea. He really wants to play f5. The problem is, his center is too torn apart, and his king is in the middle of the board. You can't really play attacking moves like that when your king is vulnerable and your center has disintegrated. Pawn takes pawn, and here, f5. So white plays the move he's been aiming at this whole time. And Fischer could just take the pawn, actually, and after capturing twice, knight comes to d6, hits the queen, and knight to b4, threatening knight to c2 check, and we can see already white is in big trouble. But Fischer wants to push back against his opponent. So he plays the move e4, counterattacking the pawn at f3 and opening up the long diagonal for his bishop at g7. A strong move. Queen e4 is probably the best way to go for white, but instead he takes the bishop on e6. Fischer captures on f3, and gf3 is played. So after all of this, the white king is still stuck on e1. So now Fischer creates a series of threats that leads to a beautiful conclusion. His first move here is f5, threatening f4, forking the bishop and the knight. So to deal with that threat, white plays f4 to control the f4 square, so there's no fork. Fischer plays the knight to f6. Now bishop to e2, rook f to e8. Not only is he going to capture the e6 pawn, but he's also going to put a lot of pressure on this sensitive e file. Now, white plays king to f2. He could have just castled, but after rook e6, there's a lot of pressure building on the file. If he tries to save the bishop with bishop c5, b6, bishop a3, then knight to d4, you're hitting this bishop, and if you defend it with queen to d1, the rook comes over, and black's pieces are just way too active in this position for white to survive. So he tries to castle artificially, hoping he can save his material that way. White plays king to f2, and he wants to move the rook over. This way, his king helps to defend the bishop at e3. That's the idea. Rook takes e6, rook to e1, rook a to e8, and then bishop to f3. And it looks like white is very close to consolidating and maybe even surviving. But this is when Fischer plays a gorgeous combination. Really, really amazing. The first thing he does is he takes the bishop on e3. He gives up the exchange. Rook takes rook, rook takes e3, king takes e3. Now, do you see Fischer's next move? Well, you know it's a queen sacrifice, and he plays this move, queen to f4 check. A devastating blow that he had been setting up for a few moves already. And white actually resigned in this position. The problem, if he takes the queen, then bishop to h6 is checkmate. The king has simply nowhere to go, and the knight and bishop take away any possible flight squares. That would be it. The only alternative would be to play king to f2, then knight to g4 check, taking advantage of the pin of the bishop. King g2, the knight comes in, hits the f3 bishop, queen to h1 to defend, and then it just very quickly, the game would be over. A beautiful game from the great Bobby Fischer, constructing a study-like checkmate in an actual game. I hope you've enjoyed it. And by the way, even after going over this great game from Fischer, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you need to watch will be in this video right here. Be sure to check that next for some really amazing chess.